Okay, hello and welcome to A Drink with the Shrinks. This will just be a drink with a shrink today, as Luke is MIA. It was his birthday yesterday, so I think maybe, I don't know, I don't want to speculate, but maybe he's in recovery, I don't know. But, so I will be flying the ship solo. Felt like it was time to get another episode out. So I wanted to talk today about a book that I wrote on the Forever 27 Club. And for those of you that don't know that term, it refers to musicians who have died at the age of 27, and there's been quite a few of them. But the four big ones that I wrote about in my book were Kurt Cobain, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and Jim Morrison. Those are the big ones. There have been others. And I think that the reason that this is so interesting to people is their lives followed very similar patterns. And it sort of can be thought of as this better to burn out than to fade away concept, and live fast, die young, leave a good-looking corpse. And, you know, in a way, it almost became sort of glamorized. But when you actually look at the way these people lived and the way their deaths sort of came about, very tragic stories. And, you know, any life that's ended at 27. But I think that one thing that I talked about in this book a lot was the idea that part of what made them so great, part of what sort of sparked their talent, was also part of what destroyed them. And so I think that's very interesting to think about in terms of that relationship between kind of creativity and madness and catharsis and channeling all of these things, these emotional sort of issues we have into our art. I think that's a good thing. But I think with these guys, it really had this unusual sort of effect of creating a very self-destructive pattern. And again, we're going to talk about, I'll explain that a little bit more, because I would never want to suggest that they weren't just amazingly, brilliantly, beautiful, talented people who brought an amazing amount of pleasure and joy to the world. But the fact remains is that these stories are tragedies. And I say this, and I'll start with Kurt Cobain, because I am from the Northwest, and he was the most recent member of the club, at least the most recent, well-known of this group. And I can remember in the Northwest, man, there were vigils and thousands of kids taking to the streets in Seattle and Aberdeen, a little bit west where he's from. And it was like a kind of royalty had died. And, you know, the grunge shirts, we probably can still think about those red flannel shirts, and there was definitely a certain look that came along with being grunge. And I think it's interesting to think about Kurt's story in terms of just what grunge was. Grunge was a backlash against the sort of music from the 80s. You had the hair bands, and you had kind of the bubblegum pop stuff. The 80s had a lot of great stuff, and I love the 80s, but it was a different kind of music. And you think about the early 90s, this very raw, angry kind of untethered sound that came out. And Kurt Cobain was on the vanguard of that. And I think why he was so popular was because a lot of people could identify with the themes that he was talking about. He was talking about alienation and isolation and this anger and this raw emotion and this idea of kind of not fitting in. And it was something that a lot of kids could relate to. And so I think that is really kind of interesting to consider in terms of Kurt's story, because what he went through in his life kind of mirrored some of the things that other kids were going through in the society at the time. And so perhaps it was kind of perfect timing in some ways. But in actually looking at what went on with him, it's just good to start at the beginning. And for Kurt, I think probably the most traumatic thing that happened was his parents' divorce at the age of 9. He was 9. And this was something that just really, really damaged him. He's an extremely sensitive kid. And so he was supposed to live with his mom. His mom is more of a gentle soul, and his dad's kind of a tough guy. He likes sports. He's a coach. It's a very kind of tough town, Aberdeen. It's kind of a rural logging kind of town. And Kurt wanted to live with his dad, who lived in a trailer with Kurt's grandparents. And again, his dad was just very much a man's man, and Kurt's kind of a little guy, and he's not that good at this stuff, and he rejected all of his things. And so he had this, and one thing that happened sort of in these years is his dad got remarried, and his dad had specifically promised Kurt that he would never do that. So that's something that wounded Kurt very, very deeply, and it's something that had an effect on him for the rest of his life. And like a lot of kids in these situations where you kind of are not feeling like you're getting enough attention, you learn to get negative attention. So Kurt kind of kept up in the ante. He became kind of a deviant, impulsive, hyperactive, and he just kept kind of pushing them further and further, sort of vandalism and some really crazy acting out behavior, and very much the opposite of what the family value was that his dad had tried to set, sort of the man's man kind of thing. And Kurt kind of drifted towards the arts, and he did drop out of high school eventually, and so he sort of was becoming everything his parents did not want him to become. And so you think about the roots of his anger, the roots of sort of this reaction. If you listen to Nirvana's music, it's sort of this raw backlash against what was going on in the society. But in a way, you could sort of reduce that down to a lot of it was perhaps just Kurt's sort of raw, angry reaction against his family, and probably in particular his father. And, one thing I always try to be wary of is not to sound like everything can be explained by some psychological cliche. It's not true. People are complicated. There are any number of forces that kind of influence and shape what a person becomes. But especially when you have this level of sort of just emotional turmoil going on with someone, you really do have to look at what happened at an early age. And I think that's something I will stand by. Now, one of the ideas, thinking about Kurt's suicide a little bit, is there was quite a bit of history of suicide in his family. His mother's great-grandfather stabbed himself in front of the family. Kurt's paternal grandfather's brother shot himself. And Kurt was aware of all these sort of things that happen in the family. So suicide does tend to run in families. The Hemingways are probably one of the classic examples, but it was definitely a part of his family's folklore as well, and Kurt was well aware of it. And I think that when you think about Kurt, you obviously can't. The name Courtney Love pops up. It just does. And even when I wrote this book, and I've done a couple interviews about it, people will ask me, like, well, how can you say that Courtney didn't kill him, and there's all this evidence, and I'm not saying Courtney Love's a good person. Believe me, I don't believe that, and they were not good for each other. But I think that if you look at this history of suicide in the family, you look at Kurt's depression, his anger, his just intense feelings of loneliness and alienation, he really had a very difficult time getting close to other people. And I think of that line from Pink Floyd's we're just two lost souls swimming in a fishbowl year after year. That kind of describes Kurt and Courtney to a certain extent. And they had the one good thing they did was make a daughter. And Kurt's suicide letter was incredibly touching and very, very sad about how the world was simply too painful for him to live in anymore. And he felt like he had failed them, and he could not make that work, that attachment to other human beings. He was very isolated. If you watch the movie Last Days, it's by Gus Van Sant, it really shows him kind of just wandering around and talking to himself, and it was just this very sad sort of depiction of what he'd become, sort of this idea that not with a bang but a whimper applied to Kurt. He became, and the drugs had become such a big part of his escapism. Now, I think that's interesting to note. And one thing that's interesting to note is that he was diagnosed with ADHD at a young age and given trial Ritalin. And there is some evidence to suggest that kids that kind of follow that paradigm tend to use other kinds of drugs later in their lives. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because you're sort of imprinting the idea that a drug cures behavior. Now, if you think about a kid that's in the amount of pain, I've worked with a lot of adolescents that have been through a lot of psychological pain. And I think that's probably the most common thing I actually see is kids are just intensely angry. And what they turn to in those cases is smoking pot, drinking. It's a kind of escapism. So when you hear that term self-medication, it really does make a lot of sense. It's just like taking a break from your life for a while. It gets you out of your own head. You don't have to think about all these other sort of painful things going on, and it's really kind of an escapism. And it certainly was for Kurt. He became a pretty serious drug addict. And so you think about, like, and at the same time he's going through all this, his music is just exploding. So he goes from this very sort of alienated guy that was living under bridges and bouncing from home to home and didn't ever really have a permanent place in this world. And all of a sudden, he becomes this massive star, a millionaire, loved by millions of people, and it probably was incredibly confusing to him because in his own sort of psychological house, it was not in order at all. And so you have this sort of odd dichotomy where the world loves him so much, and he doesn't see it. He doesn't feel like that about himself at all. His art has been kind of a purging, a catharsis of all these awful things that have happened to him, and this angry, raw backlash against this world that he perceives to be so cruel, and he's loved for it, and he's idolized for it in many ways. So. And you can sort of see where this escapism, and it's one idea that comes up in psychology is called cognitive dissonance, which sort of speaks to this idea of trying the discomfort that's held by trying to hold two different ideas in your head at the same time. One idea is, Kurt, you're an amazing guy, and the world loves you. And the other is, I'm nothing. I'm worthless. My own parents didn't even want me. I couldn't even. I wasn't taken in. I kept getting rejected by people my whole life. So if you look at that difference, it's very ironic to think that the world embraced him for the very things that caused him the most pain, but it also was sort of one of the sparks of his art. And to quote Alfred Adler, the psychologist, this is the school that I studied at, the greater the feeling of inferiority that has been experienced, the more powerful is the urge to conquest, and the more violent the emotional agitation. And I think that was certainly true of Kurt. So, and I think that, again, to return to this idea that comes up with the Forever 27 Club is that it's better to burn out than to fade away. Now, that's Kurt, something that he directly said. And he was well aware of some of these deaths. And I think the difference between he and these other three was that his death was explicitly a suicide. Again, if you choosing not to believe the conspiracy narratives, which I don't personally, although the others were, one could argue, certainly passive suicides, Kurt was the most overt. Check out Last Days. It's kind of a difficult movie to watch, but it does kind of show the events leading up to his death, and he's a very disoriented, confused person living in this huge castle out in the woods, sort of in the middle of nowhere with no heat, and people are kind of popping in and out, sort of some of the sponges that had surrounded him at the end of his life. And so there was a very odd turn of events, but one could look at his story as in terms of addiction as well. The physiological effects of coming down from a drug. For anyone that's had a really, really awful hangover, times that by 5 maybe, and you think of like how you just want to crawl outside of your own skin when you're going through that, when you develop that level of an addiction to drugs. So I think probably that definitely played a role, and I think that also Kurt just could not visualize a future where he was happy. He could not see that. That picture was never crystallized in his mind, even with a daughter, even with a wife, even with millions of dollars. So in a way, an extremely tragic story. And I think his music is in a way very immortal. I see kids now that weren't even born when he died that are still very much into his music. And I think one of the reasons that I wrote this book was to sort of try and explain that although his story is an amazing one, it's also very tragic. And so for people that do look up to him, I would really, really, I do my best to encourage them to also understand what part of his art was based on sort of self-destruction and pain. So I think that's an important lesson. Check out the book, please. It's on Amazon. It's pretty cheap if you have a Kindle. So please do check it out.